Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the latest Technology Networks webinar, De-risking Drug Development, Operational Strategies to Accelerate Biotech Success. My name is George Hammond, Team Lead of Conference Production, and I'm excited to be here to be your host. Now, we have a fantastic group of experts with us today to explore the knowledge research organization model and how this can assist biotechs in transforming science into medicines to provide more predictable and superior outcomes for patients. Now, before we start the session today, I do just have a few housekeeping notes to run through. For those that are tuning in live, we will have a Q&A session and we welcome any questions that you may have. And you can submit these via the chat system to the right-hand side of the screen, and we will do our best to address as many questions as possible during the time available. And if you experience any technical issues throughout the webinar, please click the chat icon in the bottom right corner to request support. And so, without further ado, I would now like to hand over to our experts to introduce themselves and get this session underway.
Thank you very much. My name is Jeffrey Yablon. I represent, along with my colleagues, Ubuntu Research. We are a knowledge research organization who, as previously discussed, will be talking about strategies to accelerate biotech success. We come to this presentation with acknowledgement that biotech is facing an unprecedented climate of pressure, both operationally and financially. And we are constructed as a business to provide opportunities to further de-risk biotech development, reduce cost, and increase efficiency. I am a drug developer, a clinical researcher, and an educator. My colleague Vishal Mehta is founder and CEO of Ubuntu Research with more than 25 years as a drug development specific to cell and gene therapy, where he's worked for notable companies like Celgene. Dave Hoffman has the benefit of being both a scientist and a lawyer who has been a drug developer and advisor to myriad biotech companies throughout the United States and abroad. Elliot is a PhD, well-grounded in science and a commercial strategist, and has worked for many notable companies. Collectively, we'll be talking about what operational strategies can be employed to increase efficiency and reduce costs, areas where biotechs can reduce costs without compromising quality or speed. And we can talk about what embedded regulatory intelligence will be provided and how to align an organization cross-functionally so silos are broken down and there's more collective output in your endeavor. Lastly, we'll be talking about ways to differentiate your biotech and achieve better outcomes at lower costs with the same, if not higher levels of quality. So we'll be talking a bit about the KRO or philosophy, and what a KRO is probably a term you're not familiar with. We'll be talking about novel strategies for asset deployment and development. We'll also be talking about how you can achieve a well-needed healthy balance between investment in science and systems, and talk about how regulatory and market strategies need to be considered very, very early in the developmental life cycle. Lastly, we'll focus on product success and how to close the loop between bold science and disciplined execution. So if we go to the next slide, turn it over to Vishal to talk about the parable of Icarus.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. As Jeff sort of introduced the learning objectives, one of the first things I thought we would speak about is really the challenge that's facing our industry today, and how do we look at it through the lens of the parable of Icarus, but not through the traditional eyes of hubris and ambition, but really through the needs of today's biotech organizations. So we recognize that biotech founders and investors really need to have ambition as part of their goal, because we wouldn't achieve some of the breakthrough science that we have in the past 2 decades without that. But we also need to ensure that these are supported by the right systems. And this is where we really talk about having an operating system that matches clinical stage assets as they transition out of the lab and are ready to be tested in patients in clinical trials, and have the operating system that really enables them to really do justice to the asset under investigation. So what we need is really to understand that infrastructure problem that's going to drive some of the purpose and ambition of the founders of early stage biotechs, where our current systems may appear or may sort of be designed in a little bit more of a fragile and fragmented way that doesn't allow for today's modern science, such as cell and gene therapy, to fully thrive into it. The second challenge that we see is really this need to build too early. So if you think about an asset or a company that's transitioning from preclinical to clinical, very quickly they have to build new capabilities and new organizational paradigms, everything spanning from translational and biomarker science and strategy, all the way through vendor oversight, and how do they ensure that all of the vendors are tuned into that strategy and are delivering in sync with what the expectations of both the business are and how the science is elucidating itself as we learn through emerging clinical data. That's a choice that I think we'll talk a little bit about in terms of how historically that's reflected in terms of how capital is deployed in these early stage biotechs. The third piece that we need to really look into is the current models that support drug development in general, were built largely from the lens of large and medium pharma. This is the CRO model, the consultant model, and while they're really well designed for what pharma and mid-sized pharma are operating under, they're not really the tools that enable early stage biotechs to achieve the success. So what happens in this situation is, we see delays, cost overruns, and significant need for rework and failures. And this is the operating principle that we're developing at Ubuntu, where we really want to be able to articulate an environment that enables flexible, nimble operations, bringing in all of the right expertise, the right processes that allows these companies to achieve their full potential in the most ambitious manner possible, right? So really, we want to support the ambition of the founders, the investors in the biotech, and we want to be able to do that with the right level of support, the right level of diligence that enables them to transition this science. We really build the operating systems for the clinical development world. So, while there are many things that go into drug development, our focus is really that clinical stage drug development that allows the expertise of the experts on the clinical lens to be able to both strategize and design programs through right product profile development, right clinical development pathways, and really achieve a faster, safer, better, and a further reaching clinical program than what we've envisioned today. So in summary, what Ubuntu does is it doesn't limit ambitions. It really engineers the wings that are necessary for Icarus to fly and really achieve those aspirational scientific breakthroughs and translate them to medicines for patients.
So as we move to the next slide, we'll be speaking to how the Knowledge Research Organization, KRO model, directly can beneficially impact early stage biotechnology companies. So once again, Vishal will introduce the form, function, and output of this new contemporaneous model.
Yep, thank you, Jeff. So many of you are familiar with CROs, and I think we've worked that if you're in the pharmaceutical drug development space, you've worked with CROs in some capacity, whether that's working with labs, outsourced clinical CROs, or other functional partners such as imaging, IVRs, et cetera, that really provide the services that are essential for drug development. And these CROs have been and continue to be an integral part of how drug development is done, how medicines are brought forward, and how drugs are approved through the regulatory pathway. What we're proposing today is an alternative model that really looks to bring in the level of scale and efficiency that's necessary for today's fragile biotech environment. And if we can build on this slide a little bit, this is based on 4 key pillars that we have envisioned as we thought about some of the existing limitations and the designs that would allow for overcoming those limitations. So what I'm hoping that at the end of this, both at the end of this slide and the end of this presentation, you will appreciate this new philosophical thinking that we're introducing, which is enabled by an underlying operating model, which we probably won't get a whole lot of time to get into, but I would love to leave you with an impression that there are alternative strategies that are available today that are both groundbreaking as well as, challenging the traditional norm in the way that we've developed drugs. Because if there's one thing that is very consistent in our approach of drug development, and one thing that's been very steadfast, it's been the time that it takes for drugs to be approved through the regulatory pathways. The success rates have been stringently low in the single digits or low double digits. And we've seen these drugs take anywhere between 12 to 15 years to go through the full cycle. So if we're looking outwards, and if we really want to be able to leverage the breakthroughs that we're seeing in some of the scientific innovations, like genetic medicines being an example, we are going to have to rethink how we tool this process. So one of the first domains of the 4 domains that I would like to talk about today is really the expertise, right? So as an early stage biotech, we need to build in the right level of clinical strategists who can come in and really design that program for success, understand the landscape, understand the market positioning, understand what are the challenges that you're looking to overcome, what's the population you're looking to address. And this is all sort of bundled in through, the solution engineering that we're building in. But we call this out specifically because this is the cornerstone of what it takes to build a biotech today and to ensure that they have the right clinical programs, the right clinical strategy, the right designs that will allow for these trials to achieve its regulatory and patient impact milestones. Next slide, or next build. So along with that, we put in a very sort of strong lens on financial and business stewardship. What does this mean? We don't look at this as a transactional relationship between a provider, like I was describing earlier, the CRO and the biotech company, or the sponsor, as we would call it through the regulatory definition. We really look to see how we can create better aligned relationships, collaborative relationships that really represent the strategic, ethical, and financial interests of the organization, the asset, and all of the stakeholders that are involved to really create the best clinical value chain that we can for that company, for that asset. This is paired with the right level of enterprise risk management principles, which are super important, and we'll talk a little bit about this through the presentation, with a reminder that risk really needs to be well characterized because risks can become very strategically fatal for organizations, and there's ample of examples out there where we've seen risk management not really being well thought out, not thought out early enough, and the appropriate mitigations not being built into the business. The next pillar of how we think about the KRO model is really value creation, right? Are we in a position to create value for all of the stakeholders that are involved in this process of new drug development? And we think of this through sort of 2 lenses. One is, how do we create the efficiencies, whether that's the capital efficiency, resource efficiency, time efficiency, right? Time is probably one of the most element that we can think about in terms of how it impacts the design of these organizations. But most importantly, from my perspective, the impact on patients, right? Because there are patients today that are in need of these medicines. And in looking at us as an industry to see how quickly can we shepherd them through the development process so that we can establish a clinical benefit of this for the right patient population in the right disease setting for the maximum impact that we can achieve for those patients. So this is, again, a lens that we put very strategically as we build these programs and think about the sustenance of these programs in a small biotech type organization. And last but not least is really thinking about that culture element, right? Because every time you create new companies, we're essentially creating new cultures. But is there a way for us to really conglomerate that culture in an institutional way where we can start bringing this learning mindset through the course of how we engineer our work, how we structure our DNA across the other 3 domains? So it becomes a continuously learning mindset organization, right? One that does not have to be infused with that every time, but it's part of the ethos of which we operate. And much of this comes through intellectual humility, right? Being able to say, things that we don't know, but we know how to ask the right questions. We know where to look for the right data or to generate the right data, and then make the appropriate decisions so that we can actually be smarter, better, and faster in the way that we actually deliver these drugs for patients. So as you can see in
So
summary, really three stakeholders that we look on the left side that are sort of the inputs into the funnel. So it's your investors who are really putting their capital in to help bring these novel scientific breakthroughs to the patients. It's all of the founders that are out there that are working hard in their labs, trying to identify the next important discovery that's going to lead into a potential therapeutic for patients. And it's really the patients themselves that are sort of waiting on the other side, really looking to see how they can benefit from these early discoveries, either through participation in clinical trials or eventually as having access to this through the commercial setting when the drugs are approved by the regulatory agencies. And as a KRO, we transact all of this through the external environment that we operate in. So these are the clinical sites where the clinical research and the trials are conducted, the regulators that we interface with to ensure that we are providing them with immaculate data so that we can support our hypothesis that we've put through in our clinical protocols, and all of this vendor interface that we interact with, the CROs, the labs, and all of them, so that we can, again, be very guided in the way that we approach drug development. We can build in the right level of capital efficiency, and we can design for the highest degree of flexibility for tomorrow's biotech so that we can achieve the best results for patients. And that's really what Ubuntu is at the end of the day. It's a knowledge research organization that is embedded across these principles to achieve a paradigm shift in value creation.
So, gentlemen, from a legal, regulatory, and commercial perspective, I'd love for Dave and Elliot to provide their input and opinion about how early thought to these kinds of programs can be embedded into the overall strategy, because we at Ubuntu fundamentally believe that everything starts with a plan, a living plan that is reworked and revised as appropriate. So Dave and or Elliot, your perspectives from commercial, regulatory, and legal. You're on mute, Dave.
Thank you. I'm glad I was the first person to have that happen. Thanks, everyone. I think there's two main buckets of that legal's especially helpful for in terms of kind of setting the table. And I think the first is generally in contracting. One of the biggest pain points in clinical development is setting up contractual relationships with your sites. And it's typically not as big a deal for a phase one, but as you get into phase two and phase three, where you bring more and more sites online, it can be a significant time commitment and a source of real frustration for the organization. So one of the things I always like to do with clients is spend some time looking at clinical development clinical trial agreement templates. And I think there's a couple of reasons it's important to do that early. One is the kind of agreement that you use or the kind of template that you use will vary depending on the kinds of centers that you're working with. So for example, academic cancer centers typically tend to be state institutions, and they're often going to have constraints in what they can and can't accept in the contract that private centers won't have. And the second thing is just kind of making sure that your own organization understands kind of what the essential kind of have to have provisions are and what the nice to have components are, so that you can kind of put together a negotiating playbook from the beginning, which will guide you as you go through these multiple negotiations in parallel. And the second thing is from a regulatory and intellectual property perspective, I think it's important to understand how your product is covered by the intellectual property the company has either in-licensed or owns. And to think about some of the downstream issues in terms of when's your patent term, what's your longest patent term, and how's it gonna align with your clinical development timeline, for example. Are there gaps in your coverage that might be worth filing new applications to fill? And what kind of groundwork do you need to lay for either Orange Book or Purple Book listing down the road, and for applications for patent term extension or supplemental protection certificates in Europe. And so I think, the earlier you can start thinking about these things, the more effectively you can navigate some of those potential pitfalls.
Thank you, Dave. Elliot, your thoughts?
Sure, thanks. I mean, I'll echo Dave on starting early. From the commercial perspective, in my view, commercial planning doesn't start when you have a registration package in hand or you're getting ready to launch the product. It's not a discrete stage in development either. It really needs to be a key thread woven throughout the entire development strategy for a product, starting from the beginning, helping guide that product from the ambiguity of the early stages of development toward real market opportunities that provide commercially viable outcomes for the company and that really match the attributes of those products with the needs of patients in the long term. But unfortunately, most early stage companies don't have the luxury of hiring a commercial team at that stage. At best, they may be lucky to have a chief business officer or a CEO who has commercial experience hands on, who may be able to provide some of that vision and force for the company. But I feel that a KRO model is a great way of enabling early stage companies, smaller or leaner companies, to engage in this type of critical planning efforts much earlier in the process and avoid the pitfalls of not making those early efforts. What you need in that setting is a partner who can operate like an internal team member, but still provide the flexibility and the objective guidance of an external partner. Someone who can help envision that value of a product that hasn't been shaped yet and craft that vision with you for investors to create realistic excitement about the market opportunities and potential of new products.
Thank you very much. So my next question, closing out this section to the group at large, is are biotech funders and founders not considering all of these issues? And if so, why are they not being implemented in the way that you all have described?
Uh, I think in my experience, oftentimes legal hire for a small biotech is pretty far down the list of priorities for a small company that is trying to get up and running because of the pressure, coming from your investors is let's get to clinical proof of concept as soon as we can. And a lot of founders don't understand how a lawyer can help with that. And I think the second thing is that oftentimes outside counsel, which every company will have, is simply just not as kind of plugged into the day-to-day that's happening at the company or the longer term strategy, so that they often are playing catch up when some of these kind of issues do arise.
Vishal, Elliot, your thoughts?
I think we'll be able to get into some of those as we go into the next slide, Jeff, that we really start drilling down into some operational, solutions.
And at a higher level, I'd just say that I think investors, founders, I don't think they're not realizing or recognizing those issues, but it's an optimization problem. And there are never enough resources, never enough time to do everything that you'd love to do that comprehensive development work. And so there need to be decisions, strategic decisions and trade-offs that are made. And I think a theme of this webinar is that some of those trade-offs are changing as the world changes.
Thank you all. We'll move on to the next slide then. This is where, as we say in the US, where the rubber meets the road. These are clear-cut operational strategies to reduce the clear and apparent risk and accelerate timelines and things that can be done. So I open up to my colleagues to speak to these strategic levers and the impact and some of the examples associated with employing these types of decision-making using a KRO methodology early and often.
I'm happy to jump in first from a commercial perspective. Coming from that place of starting early, I think a true North Star for a development program needs to be a target product profile. I think that's kind of the pinnacle of that early commercial planning work in partnership with a clinical group. And that target product profile needs to be based not just on the current standard of care or how things have traditionally been done, but on the evolving standard of care, where the puck is going in the future. And commercial input into the target product profile is critical. This isn't just on paper what we think our product can do. This is what our product needs to deliver to be able to meet the needs of the market, of patients, of physicians, of regulators, of payers, to get to that level. And it's not something that's just based on clinical evidence. It is something that's based on what the world needs for a product in the future. Beyond the target product profile, patient segmentation and getting that straight early on. I think using the input of a commercial lens, we can focus further on unmet needs and navigating the competitive landscape in the way that certain groups of patients may or may not be best served by new medications that are being developed. Clinical endpoints, again, you think of that as a clinical or regulatory issue, but these are crucial for payers to be able to make objective decisions about funding medicines in a crowded healthcare environment. And finally, comparator choices for clinical trials. Again, this is not just about the clinical outcomes. It's critical for prescribers and regulators to make their decisions, but especially for payers. And the choice of a comparator could be a life or death decision for a commercial product in a health technology assessment market where your price is tied to the price of your comparator in your clinical trial. So I think in summary, understanding the market, the standard of care, and the competitive landscape in appropriate depth for that phase of development is absolutely essential to maximizing the future commercial opportunity of a product and making that company more investable and avoiding down-term failure in the market ultimately after great development work and a great product's been developed. And without early commercial input, you risk developing a product that the market doesn't want or doesn't need, or that payers may be unable to reimburse because the right type of evidence isn't there. So the plug for this would be that commercial needs to start early and that it's not just about launching the product, it's about guiding the path for development hand in hand with all of the cross-functional players to develop something that's right for the company and for the investors and for patients in the future.
So Dave, with a legal regulatory lens, your thoughts?
Yep, I was just about to say now, thanks for that, Elliot. That perspective was super helpful. And as a lawyer who trained as a patent attorney first, I started getting excited as soon as you started talking about TPP and patient stratification and all those things, because those filing patent applications to cover specific methods of treatment, for example, the trial protocol that might be in your IND, for example, or making sure you have a series of sort of picture claims that cover exactly your target product profile. Super helpful for a whole host of reasons. One is it gives you a great way to kind of make sure that you have narrow coverage that is going to probably hold up better if it's challenged at some point in the future at the patent office or in court. Second thing is it's going to make any kind of generic competition more difficult, right? Because you're going to have a lot more kind of characterization data as you file those kinds of narrow applications, as you're further along your development pipeline. All those things just advocate for effective partnership between the sort of IP side of the legal function and the commercial side to make sure that patents are fundamentally business tools. And so if your patent strategy is not aligned with your business and commercial strategy, then your patent portfolio isn't worth very much. So I think the sooner that you can kind of get plugged into those conversations, the more effectively you'll be able to support the enterprise.
Thank you. If you could click one more time to get the bottom summary of this slide. So well-used phrases, companies don't plan on failing, they fail to plan. So I think my colleagues have well articulated the need for early effective planning, not only considering the scientific elements, but also the commercial, legal, and operational ones. So what we represent that a very carefully delineated clinical strategy will reduce risk, increase efficiency, and make for a better outcome. What can't be controlled is the science, but everything around the science can be controlled and costs can be mitigated and efficiencies can be gained. So with that being said, we can move to the next slide, please. What we want to talk about in this section is areas where biotechs can save costs without compromising quality. Now, the traditional model has really been associated with internal fixed headcounts. Once financing is made available, the aim is to build an organization. Uh, there were some clear benefits to doing so and some dangers in doing so as well. The dangers are in terms of timeline acceleration. It takes time for that team to form and storm and norm and get through all the rigors of coalescing and getting into their individual silos. And those silos are both of benefit and also can create problems. The next issue is insourcing versus outsourcing and optimizing that. Looking at structured workflows or internal and external activities, providing RACEs that eliminate redundancies. We, in the KRO model, look at just-in-time activity-based right-size deployment, the right people, process, technology, at the right time, at the right place, at the right cost. As we move to the third block, which speaks to the technology investment, what the management team of an early stage biotech needs is collation of information and answers to key questions. They don't all have to be at a maximum cost. They can be provided cost effectively and efficiently to give the organization the insights when asking the right questions at the right time. Now, what we bring forward is our strategy of lean and agile development that will deliver the greatest impact. And by doing so, you create outsized value for stakeholders. And I'll close out by saying Ubuntu is not a unicorn in terms of our thinking and ways of doing things. We know the industry at large is constantly striving for ways to do things faster, better, and less costly. What we at Ubuntu provide is a differentiated solution that impacts all three of those key levers. And our experience and our examples working with other clients have shown a clear financial, time, and efficiency benefit. And that's what we are espousing. And our plea to the industry at large is to continue to explore ways of doing things in the most lean and agile manner possible, because funding is becoming more and more precious and harder to come by. Therefore, employing those financial assets in the most appropriate manner will yield the greatest level of success. We can move to the next slide, please. So this is for our group at large. First of all, we're going to be talking about regulatory and market intelligence, as Dave and Elliot have well spoken about, and looking at by providing this kind of input and output early and often in the developmental life cycle will lead to what we are showing on the right-hand side in terms of better predictability, speed, quality, and overcoming the valley of death, which is a term that I think has been well used, but not necessarily well understood. So why don't we start with that in terms of how the elements on the left impact that valley of death and what that means to Ubuntu and its impact on biotech. Michelle, your thoughts on that to start?
Absolutely. I mean, I think as just sort of Jeff described, right, this is really thinking about what is the right fit for purpose infrastructure. And, by fit for purpose, it's really about thinking about what's the nature of the infrastructure that's necessary at any point in time on that early stage biotech life cycle. And the value of that really describes that time period where the business hasn't really reached a positive inflection point in terms of cash flow generation versus business valuations. And while you're in the trough of the valley of death, it's important for you to recognize that there needs to be mechanisms for the business to really accelerate, or as Jeff described in one of the earlier slides, impact the velocity at which the companies are able to transition, for example, from IND to phase one, because there is a significant order of magnitude shift in terms of how the business is valued financially, strategically, scientifically, once you have clinical data that really starts to demonstrate the safety largely in a phase one, but also some early stage efficacy, which then leads into the full deployment. So in that sense, overcoming the valley of death is really about, that speed of transition from, say, pre-IND into generating your first set of clinical data that the investors can then embrace and partners can absorb and really start to look for that strategic fit across the pipeline.
So Dave and Elliot, as you look at the block indicating better predictability of risk, employment of the KRO model from a commercial, legal, and regulatory point of view, how does that better predict risk and give you opportunity to make course correction as necessary?
Do you want to jump in, Elliot, or shall I?
Go ahead.
Okay, thanks. One thing that I think is helpful, and I think one of the benefits that having kind of an experienced corporate counsel on the team is typically, your biotech companies managing a whole bunch of different legal service providers. Your HR's probably got an employment lawyer on retainer. There's often a regulatory lawyer involved. There's outside patent counsel. There's corporate counsel helping you with your fundraising, right? And I think it can be very difficult, especially for younger founders and newer entrepreneurs who don't have a ton of experience managing counsel, to kind of coordinate all those activities, manage them in a way that will first and foremost minimize cost, which is always a priority given what billing rates are these days. But secondly, ensure that everybody is kind of well enough informed that you can kind of keep moving in the same direction more effectively, right? So you don't want to have to keep kind of chasing after people for things, and you want to have a unified strategy to the extent that you can. And so somebody who spent a lot of time working with outside counsel, both or being outside counsel in both cases actually, is typically well positioned to hopefully spot those issues preemptively and deal with those issues as they come up, but also to work effectively without outside counsel, to minimize spend and maximize sort of return on investment.
Anything to add, Elliot?
Sure. I think of the Valley of Death, I was reminded we took a road trip earlier this year and got to that point in the drive where you see last gas for 200 miles or something like that. And that really resonated with me in thinking about this example of the Valley of Death. If you're an early stage biotech company that's trying to get through clinical proof of concept to be able to get either to a next stage of a raise or a partnership with a strategic, you need to know the resources that you're going to need to get there. And having that predictability, knowing the path that you're going to take, knowing the efficiency of your car and when you're going to need to stop that next time, what you need to bring with you going trekking in the desert, having that greater sense of predictability up front allows for planning and getting through to that other side, knowing where you might need to pull off and stop, where you might need to shut off the air conditioning and drive a little slower because you're going to need to really stretch that little bit that you've got to get to the next stage. And I think that part of that comes not just about the visibility of external resources and the way you work with those external partners. Part of it is also the regulatory strategy itself. And that strategy can't be linear and inflexible. It needs to be scenario based from the start because things fall apart, the world changes, and you need to be prepared for those. So in working through scenario planning and understanding what might go wrong, what those risks are, you can't solve for all of them early on, but having gone through that process, you have a much greater visibility of the horizon of those risks. And you can start to plan for the highest probability ones early on to make sure that when things change or when you reach a certain decision point, that a potentially foreseeable risk or outcome doesn't catch you by surprise and leave you on the back foot.
Thank you. In the interest of time, we'll move on to the next slide. Very quickly, I just want to discuss how to align the cross-functional stakeholders to avoid silos. Our key commentary and takeaway we'd like to leave you with that if you don't engineer integration, you engineer friction. Most organizations are very silo-based. Regulatory doesn't talk to clinical on a normative basis. IT doesn't necessarily get involved in clinical decision making or regulatory strategy. What we try to foster is an environment where cross-functional KPIs are instilled in the organization, and that then develops a very focused product culture approach to drug development. We also very much look to integrate business systems to create a single version of the truth. It's a term that's well used in our organization. What we want to provide is the deployment of information and decision making where everybody relevant is involved and there is shared goal and resolve based upon the actionable information and insights that are provided. So what we really look at the key performance determinants in clinical asset development, embodying those, breaking down the silos, using people, process, technology brought together. So insights are provided early and often, and decision making is made in such a way that all available information is taken into consideration. So our closing slide on this presentation, if you move to the next one, there are ways to differentiate your biotech to achieve stronger outcomes. We're not alone in this, but we have a value equation and a business operational viewpoint that we think benefits industry and that industry is looking for at this point in time. Our plea to you all is that you take note that you need to balance the scientific and operational risk. You need to create infrastructure that allows you to generate better business predictability and also a keen eye toward capital efficiency, increasing the efficiency, reducing cost. They are not disparate elements, but can be brought together effectively to create a better outcome. And lastly, our objective is to work with clients to build a lean and agile infrastructure that is very responsive to the need of the asset and the need of both the financial considerations, clinical and operational implications of asset development. So with that, we will close out this section, open it up for questions. We thank you very much for taking the time to listen to the KRO story and ways in which we can assist early stage biotech founders and funders to actionably create a better output than the traditional way of doing things. And we think the market is right for it, and we can more certainly be of assistance in that regard. So we thank you, and we will open it up to any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jeff, Vishal, Elliot, and Dave. That was a incredibly fantastic discussion, and we very much appreciate you sharing your expertise and insights with us all today. As mentioned, before we close out this session, we will now transition to the Q&A, where I'd like to take a few minutes to address some of the wonderful audience questions that we have received. So the first question that I would like to pose to the group is, why is the lean and agile model not being fully adopted, especially given the current macroeconomic challenges?
Well, gosh, I'm sure Vishal can speak to this better than I can, but I think change is hard. And sometimes it's easier to do things the way that they've always been done than it is to try something new. Sometimes I think that's a product of board governance, and sometimes I think it's a product of the kind of mentoring and feedback that some of the early stage executives are getting along the way.
I think, Dave, that's spot on. And a lot of executives that I speak to these days, they're very much, especially on the pharma side, are very much tuned into what I would call the preservation mode, right? I mean, with everything that's going on in the geopolitical environment, in the regulatory environment, in the sort of the commercial space with pricing and market access of inline products, there just isn't enough bandwidth remaining in these organizations to really think about innovation and the impact of innovation in the future. I think the pharma industry has really left this to biotech, and the biotechs are very much science focused. So as I tell my team quite routinely, it takes an outsider to come in and really pose this situation with the lens of, the scientific mindset where, we look at, data and we corroborate that it still takes 15 years and $2.5 billion and 10% probability of success to really bring a drug to market. And, if we want the next generation to really benefit from the groundbreaking science that we have, and the understand of biology, the understand of synthetic tools, the understanding of, AI and ML-based applications in drug discovery, we are going to have to accelerate this trajectory. And I think that's where at least Ubuntu's position is, that there is a different model, there is a better model, and there is a need for change at this point in time that the stakeholders need to embrace and really test it out, because doing things the same way and expecting different results, frankly, isn't what we prescribe to.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vishal, Dave, for your commentary there and your insights. That's fantastic. Now, moving on to our next question. What are some of the key and core activities that Ubuntu would typically perform in those initial phases for biotechs and as well as investors so that they can remain on their clinical development plan?
Vishal, I think you'd be best suited to answer this initially.
Yeah. No, I'd love to invite Elliot to speak to this as well, because I think he was going down this direction. But really, it's getting involved early, and it's getting involved in a systematic way where you're not just bringing on a few consultants to really think about your clinical strategy and your clinical planning or your product profile. I think what Ubuntu brings is that organized set of experts and resources that really allow you to interrogate your asset, look at your preclinical data, and really start to position your asset from a clinical development perspective. And I think this is one of the early interventions that we have, where we understand what the aspirations are. We try to tie it with the regulatory and the market intelligence and insights. And we present, scenario-based situations, right? That the investors and the founders can then make a determination of, what's the best path forward based on, all of the intelligence data that we've accumulated, the expertise that we have synthesized into that solution engineering, and really given the right options to consider for asset development.
I absolutely agree, Vishal. I think part of what Ubuntu brings is several fold in those early stages. One is the processes and the ways of working from the beginning, the decision making and operational tools, but also pre-existing positive team dynamics, which I think really enable the team to function more cohesively and fluidly from the beginning, and to bring positive organizational and team energy into an existing team setting, rather than actually being a burden that needs to be brought together. The fractional mindset does not need to mean fragmented when it comes to working with external consultants in a team. And I think by bringing together a group of folks who have like-minded ways of thinking, of working, past experience, and can bring that positive team energy from day one, really leads to a more integrated team, more team cohesion, and the ability to deliver value within days and weeks rather than months and quarters.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Elliot and Vishal. Now, I suppose really to follow up on that, it would be really great to delve perhaps deeper into some of those points that you both just mentioned. So I wonder if any of our panelists could perhaps share briefly some insights into a particular case study where you brought value to the customer following this model, if anyone would want to jump in on that.
Certainly, I can start in. I almost chuckle on this one, because this is an example where Dave was on the other side of the equation. But really, I think in one of our early engagements, what we found was we were supporting a biotech organization that was transitioning into a pivotal phase program. And while they were building their internal capabilities to do the same, we were able to come in and really strategize around the development work that was necessary to achieve the near-term business goals, because the company, obviously being an early stage organization, was very acutely aware of what they were reporting into their investors and to the street, and being able to meet those timelines around this single asset program that was being going on, where all the focus was on things like site activations and patient recruitment, as well as some of the early data emerging from that. That combined with our operational promise and looking at how the CRO and vendor contracts were done, and how those designs could be better aligned with the reformed organizational paradigm as the organization was evolving. One of the slides we talked about was the RACI, where really looking at things that were done internally within the organization versus what needed to be outsourced, so that you avoid the duplication, you avoid sort of the time loss that happens when you have multiple eyes looking at the same thing with really not much value add exercise there. So this was a case study where we were able to accelerate the organization's path to clinic and their ability to recognize their first patient and get all of their sites activated. But most importantly, we were able to recognize, I think, about a $2.5 million savings in terms of their external spend, largely because of how the organization was maturing and from understanding, what were those internal capabilities that they could bring back in. And then lastly, it was really around the quality systems, right? Because I think some of these organizations, they start with a very fragmented set of SOPs, processes that need to be well aligned to GXP requirements as you start to think about pivotal phase trial conduct.
Wonderful. I'm not sure if
Dave,
anyone
I
else
don't know if
wants.
you have a reflection.
I don't have anything to add to that, Vishal. You think you handled it beautifully. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
We'll transition to the next question then. Fantastic. Thank you again. Now, we have probably just enough time for one or two more questions before we close out this session. So switching gears slightly, on the road to commercialization, how can IP be protected effectively for early stage biotech as part of global development?
That's a question I hear a lot in my day to day. I think the first thing I would say is um, it depends, because I'm a lawyer and that's how we start, right? No, just kidding. It depends a little bit on the asset, right? So I've worked for companies where the asset's in license from a public sector research, either the National Cancer Institute or a university tech transfer office, for example. And to some degree, you get what you get in that situation, because oftentimes the IP is bundled with other things that may be of less relevance, or you have a very narrow kind of portfolio where they've only had, because budget's an issue in those situations, so they might not have filed the application as broadly around the world as you might have wanted. I think the first thing that you probably need to do is have a look at the patent estate, have a look at the kind of claims you've been able to get, or you think you're most likely to be able to get in the US, Europe, and your other key commercial jurisdictions. And then you sit down and have a chat with management, and you put together a strategy to try and fill in some of those gaps to the extent that you can. And so this means taking a look at, do you have a picture claim that aligns with the target product profile? Do you think you're going to be able to get that in the US and in Europe and in some of your other key jurisdictions, or is it likely to be harder in some of these other jurisdictions? If so, are there other steps you can take, other filings you can make that might give you a better chance to get the kind of coverage that you think you need? And can you get that kind of coverage in a timeline that aligns with your commercial development timeline as well? And I think you also need to think carefully about how the legal and patent aspect kind of dovetails with the regulatory aspect of things. So we talked a little bit about, I mentioned patent term extension, Orange Book, Purple Book listings as well, right? And so I think you need to understand what the most important patent filing or patent family is for purposes of figuring out patent term. If the patent term is going to expire early, as is the case at Cargo, one of my earlier employers, then you want to think creatively about other filings you can make that might give you a shot at extending that patent term down the road as well. Um, I think those are the kind of key things from my perspective that matter for IP. And again, as I said, patents are business tools, and so you need to ensure that your patent strategy is aligned with your business strategy. Otherwise, it's not much good.
And Dave, I'll tag along there. As someone who managed external IP counsel without internal counsel in a past role, I could confidently say that a legal advisor for IP who's part of the team is a massive advantage. I've worked with IP attorneys who you go to them when you need them, you step away. 6 months later, you're there again. But somebody who's clued into the business strategy, not just the docketing and the office actions, but who's in close touch with the executive team, who can understand and kind of live and breathe that the values and the energy and the direction of the company, is going to be able to craft a strategy and partner with the team infinitely better than someone who's truly at arm's length throughout that process.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for those answers. It's very much appreciated. And now for our last question. I'd like to position this to all of our speakers, starting with you, Vishal. Do you have any final key takeaway messages to the biotech investors, founders, as well as the functional leaders on how best to adopt this KRO model?
Yeah, I mean, I think we started with this theme where, I think it's time in the industry where, the science is probably at its peak that we've seen. We have an obligation on our hands to be able to deliver to the promise of science, and trying to do this through our traditional tools and mechanisms, especially in a macroeconomic and political climate that is certainly challenging, to say the least. I think it's a big task on the hands of the founders and investors of this community. So we're here to help. We're here to sort of offer a novel, discrete way of thinking about how we can execute in clinical development, really through timeline acceleration, but also couple that with significant cost savings, and really a strategy that enables the downstream partners to be able to execute it with the level of precision that any biotech founder would expect. So that's the value proposition that we're putting out there, and we're really looking forward to engaging with like-minded individuals who are ready to take on this new approach.
Excellent. I'd just like to invite Dave, Elliot, if you have any final key takeaways as well.
Sure. I would say lawyers are an essential part of the team, but they're expensive. And so to the extent you can bring in a fractional team member who has experience both as a provider of legal services and a consumer of legal services, I think you'll be a lot happier in the long run.
And I would say, same way. You don't need to do this alone. The large tactical operators that have been out there for a while have served a very critical purpose, especially in late stage development. But Ubuntu, I think, is indicative of a new generation of partners for biotech that arises out of a true need, and who can really integrate strategy with operations, who don't need to have something tossed over the wall that's in fully elucidated form, and they go off and do it. This is a new breed of service partners who can help with real hands-on, real-world experience, come in and integrate and partner and drive innovation, not just execution.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Unfortunately, that does bring us to the end of this session today. Now, as we wrap up, I'd like to thank once again all of our panelists for sharing your expertise and your insights with us. Now, we've explored a great deal during this session, and we are very grateful to each of you for your input. Just a quick reminder to our audience that this session will now be made available on demand for the next 30 days, and you can continue to ask questions during this period, and we will send these across to the speakers to address offline. So that just leaves me to say a massive thank you once again to our expert panel, and to the audience. We will see you again soon at our next Technology Networks webinar. Thank you and goodbye.